Processing and planning a transition season can be really challenging. The good news is that we are never alone. Support and resources are available. Thanks for joining me today on Navigate. I'm Tim Austin, and this podcast is designed to take the guesswork out of transition. Whether a transition is looming in your future or you're trying to make sense out of a past or current transition, this show's for you. In each episode, we'll introduce strategies and tools individuals and teams can use to effectively navigate seasons of change. At Navigate, we want to help you leverage the challenges of change for optimal growth. Today, I'll be talking to Laura Anderson as she shares her personal transition story. Laura has recently transitioned back to life in the U.S. after nearly 15 years as a foreign missionary at a children's center in Mozambique. During her time overseas, she felt God developing in her a heart for the unique needs of global workers. She is thrilled to be continuing as a missionary, home-based this time, developing a missionary member care program for her organization. So join me and Laura as we discuss her recent transition. Thanks so much for joining me today, Laura.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm so excited that we can have this conversation today. And we go back quite a few years because we're friends from our college years at Bethany University, a little private university tucked in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And yeah, like a lot of us, most of us from those years, we all kind of scattered and found ourselves working, serving, living in different places, and some even and some more remote places than others, like us in Central Asia and you guys and you in Mozambique. Yeah, so it's interesting, obviously to kind of track with your college friends over the years, and I think that we kind of lost track for a while, but then somehow something some situation or friends or maybe a Facebook page or something kind of reconnected us. So,
Facebook rekindled so many friendships.
Yes. Yeah. Well, tell us, Laura, what exactly did you do in Mozambique?
Well, Tim, I went to Mozambique. My heart was to go, since I was a teenager, I wanted to care for orphaned, abandoned, abused, and neglected children. And so I went to work at a children's center with Iris Ministries. My first year, however, I did agree to be the head of hospitality. We had between 500 to 1,000 visitors a year, and so my role was to care for their whole process, their whole visit. So I had some time with the kids, but not nearly enough. So after that first year, I had the wonderful privilege to move into Dorm 5, which became known as Manalora's dorm. And I worked and lived with the 5 to 8-year-old boys. When I moved in the dorm, I had 48 boys that first year, which was crazy.
How many again?
48.
Wow, that's a lot of kids.
A lot of boys in one space in the same.
That's being mom to a lot of kids.
It is, and I did not do that by myself. I had Mozambique National staff who worked wonderfully. I worked alongside of them caring for the kids. On average, I probably had close to the 30 during the rest of my 14 years that I was privileged to work in Dorm 5. So that was the main role that I had during my time. I had my fingers in a lot of pies, as you do in a small mission base. Over the years, I helped in a lot of areas. But I mostly was a dorm mom to those precious kids, which was just a dream come true for me.
Wow. Okay. And was that part of the as you were going and preparing to go to Mozambique, is that something that you had on your heart to do, to work with these kids?
Yeah, that was what I had been dreaming about for a long time, even through my time at Bethany. And I don't know, I'm not sure why it took so long to get there, but since I was a teenager, I knew that someday I wanted to work with vulnerable children. I don't think I knew that term back then, but I knew that's what I wanted to do.
Great. Well, now you've mentioned you're developing a heart for global workers and, other expats who live and serve all over the world and caring for them and serving them. How did that come about? Tell me a little bit about how that transpired.
Well, I think all throughout my time in Mozambique, in addition to working with the kids and my official role, I was kind of a unofficial caregiver for a lot of the other foreign missionaries who I worked alongside. I always had a heart to pour into them and bless them and come alongside them. And I think what really facilitated that was I had been a resident assistant in college, the college that we went to together, and trained by the amazing Diana Beckstrom, who impacted so many of our lives in the
Yes, for sure.
And then I was a residence director at Vanguard University in Southern California, and that's the job I had for the 4 years prior to moving to Mozambique, which continued my training in really just coming alongside people and supporting them and encouraging their success and their ability to thrive in their setting. Previously with college students, and it became with my colleagues, my co-missionaries on the center. So I think I brought that with me. And during that time, I also did, when you're in student development, you learn programming, like fun activities, bring people together, promote unity. And so I was always doing fun events and activities. Not always. There were times I was a little tired to do that, but had a heart to do that. So, but also I was the recipient of a lot of care and support given to me through the years, both here in the U.S., but also on the field by various people. And I always knew that when I returned to the U.S. someday, I wanted to be able to invest in missionaries. I wasn't sure what that would look like. I wanted to open my home perhaps where people could stay. I wanted to send people care packages, just to do things to care for them. And I think God, I didn't really know about missionary member care at that time, but God began, when He brought that to my attention, it was like, oh, this is a good fit for where my heart's been for a long time.
Yeah. That's neat how that, like you said, kind of unofficially began to just be part of what you did out of your heart of serving and caring for others. So a long time through your years in Africa, in an unofficial capacity, you functioned as a member care person in a lot of ways. You came alongside people, and it's interesting how the Lord uses those things to prepare us for the next season. Even those unofficial roles, right?
It's amazing. He's always building and shaping us, and we don't know what He's going to develop and do with whether it's our talent or our interests. Some things we think are just, I don't know, maybe they're kind of run of the mill, but he can kind of cultivate it into something really special. Yeah.
Good. Well, so you've transitioned back to the States. You've been home, about 18 months now?
About 18 months.
Okay. So let's go back to your time of coming to this point of decision, making this transition. What were some factors, what were some things that catapulted you into this transition season in the first place?
It's such an interesting journey, isn't it? Whenever we're making those big life change decisions.
Yeah.
First, I should say that when I went to Mozambique, I went for 1 year. I committed to 1 year.
1 year turns into almost 15.
Almost 15, yeah. And I always thought that if you're there 15 years, that's kind of a missionary with a capital M. And, it comes to big calling, and I didn't feel I just wanted to say yes to the Lord. But, so I'm so glad that it did turn into that 15 years. But I didn't ever think it was going to be forever. But, I would wonder over the years, Lord, because you kind of settle in. After a few years, you're like, okay, I'm just here until the Lord moves me on. But how are you going to move me on? How am I going to know? What are you going to feel? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
And so I had experienced some times of grief and some seasons of grief and some times of almost burnout. And I'm so glad that I didn't leave during those times, because I think I would have felt almost like I gave up or was pushed out, whereas I left on a really good note. But that was kind of hard. I was still getting ideas. I was so passionate. I loved the kids, the boys and to just knowing that it was time, which is so frustrating. People say, but yeah, but how did you know? And you're like, I don't know, I just knew.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the wrestling was that I still loved it, that I just, and the work had not changed, that the needs had not changed. It wasn't that all kids were gone and I could just lock the door and say, okay, we're done here. It was stepping away from a work in progress, and that was hard. It might have been easier if I had a definitive reason or a justifiable excuse to say, well, here's why I left. But because when you tell people it's time, it's a little safety, sometimes. But
yeah.
But I didn't know. I knew in my heart,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you mentioned this shift inside, and as part of the kind of the process of releasing you from this, this role and kind of giving you permission to look into going into a new season of transition. So I think that happens a lot of times in our lives where there's this internal piece. And you're right, it is hard to explain, isn't it? It's hard to put it into words. And each of our transition stories is so unique and so personal. But you did struggle with some of those unknowns, some of those questions, in making that decision. How, Laura, did you process such a big decision?
Well, as I started to feel that kind of releasing and something was shifting and changing, of course I started really praying about that and asking God. And as a single person, I didn't have like a spouse that this was a joint decision. It really was just my decision. And so at first I wasn't telling other people because I didn't necessarily want to be influenced or, and so I was mulling it over. But as it grew in a couple months' time, I decided to tell two of my dear friends who I know pray for me. They'll give me honest feedback. They love me. And I thought, I think I want to call and say it out loud. I didn't want to email it or message it. I thought, I want to see how I feel when I say it. Like, I think my time here might be coming to a close. And when I said it, and I didn't faint or cry, which I thought would happen, and I thought I would be like, no, never mind, I don't mean it,
Yeah.
But instead it felt okay. And I thought, cool. And which was kind of a confirmation, but came with its own sort of sadness, like,
Yeah.
really is time, and that was a hard bit. But, and then I told a couple of other close friends, and as I did that, it just felt right, but, Tim, one of the hardest parts in that actual decision-making process was that, okay, I feel ready now, tell my director, and they were out of the country, and so unfortunately I told them via email. But as I drafted that email and then I sat on it for a couple of weeks, I was like, I'm not ready. It feels so final. It feels like you're giving actual notice, of your job.
Right.
And I didn't feel like I could take that back. So I drafted this email, and I used to walk for exercise up on our basketball court at night when the whole center was quiet. And so I put on my exercise shoes and my walking clothes, and I thought, I'm going to press send, and I'm going to run up to the basketball court because I'm probably going to cry and break out in tears. And, I send, and I went directly up there, and I was just amazed. I didn't break down or break into tears. I just broke out in praise to the Lord and thanking Him for the privilege of being there, for Him trusting me with such important work during those years of cultivating all those little boys' lives, His provision, and it was a joyful time reflecting on things that had happened, and of course that just cemented everything. I felt I had made the right decision. I knew that God was working in this, and I just felt really confident, and I could go forward, with the practicalities. But again, there was still sadness. I did end up in some tears. They were kind of just bittersweet tears of like, okay, it's time to bring this season to a close, and what will that look like?
Yeah. And so, yeah, right. And yet, I love what you say about you decided to say it out loud. And sometimes that's a really challenging place to get to. What are some maybe some fears around even that initial kind of verbalizing it to somebody else. What's that about? What was that about for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess it partly does have to do with being single, that you wrestle with big decisions, internally quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And then so telling other people, it makes it a little more real. Yeah. It's a little bit vulnerable. Mm-hmm. One of the things, Tim, that I found difficult was this realization that when you're going to do something like missions or any other, positive endeavor, you usually get a lot of positive feedback. Oh, that's so wonderful. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Notwithstanding the people who are sad to see you go, like the parents who are like, what?
Right.
You're getting a lot of affirmative feedback about this is wonderful, this is great. And then when you say you're done and you're leaving, it's like almost like cricket. They're not like, you're leaving, wonderful, that's great, you're going home, and then that can lead you that can leave you a little bit doubting. Am I on the right path? I'm used to getting this affirmation,
Right, yes.
But so talking to people that I was close with, and I was very selective of who I talked with at first. I mean, I have wonderful friends. I probably could have talked to anybody, but just wanted to narrow it to just a couple of people I thought I want to see, and I got a very good feedback. There were people who said to me, and it felt like they could hear in what I was saying that there wasn't a lot of indecision.
Yeah.
So that's good to have that feedback too. It's like having a little mirror held up to you when you can talk to people about things.
Yeah. And going back to what you said about, when you finally communicated this decision to leadership, I can totally relate to that, because I remember, after my wife and I made a decision to shift and to transition out of a role that really we'd been doing for almost 20 years, both in Central Asia, and at that point we were in Turkey. But when we finally made that decision, and then it came to communicating to leadership, and again, we were like you, we couldn't. It was just better because of the situation we were in to go ahead and send that email to get the ball rolling. But that was challenging, and that was hard. And I remember after sending that email of this decision we had made together to transition, it was like I told my wife, I said, I feel like I just cut off my right leg. Like something's missing here.
Yeah.
And
it felt like a real.
Yeah.
I didn't have that thought. It just felt like a solidly closing door. Like a freeze door that just solidly closed with no air escaping.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good analogy.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think that goes with any kind of transition where you've been, invested for such a long time, mm-hmm. And rooted, and relationships go deep, and all of that. There's a lot around that just makes it a challenging decision in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then how do you process that? So you mentioned you began to just talk about how you processed, and you mentioned talking to a close friend and actually verbalizing that, saying it out loud. What are some other ways you processed a big decision like this?
Well, one of the things I started doing was reading. I'm a reader, and I love researching. And I also find a lot of value in learning from other people's experiences.
Yeah.
So, I just wanted to hear what other people had done. I read some books. I read blog posts and things like that I found really helpful. Watch some videos online, but looking for those resources helped me to start with the practicalities of wrapping up, that long process of wrapping up my life and work.
And how much time did you have from the time you made a decision to transition and when you actually boarded the plane to come back to return stateside?
I had almost 6 months. I was really blessed to have that time. And it felt, I was so glad the Lord, started telling telling me that so far in advance because, especially after 15 years, I felt that that time was necessary. It was really good to have it, to be able to finish well and to say goodbye well to the Mozambican community and kind of begin that process of untying and unraveling all those threads that my life has become part of there in Mozambique, as well as for the directors to find people to be able to replace the various jobs that I had while I was there. So, because my main job was the role with the boys, but there were other things that I was helping with. I was on the leadership team, and so it was helpful for them, I think, to have enough time to adjust to my leading.
Yeah. So those are some things that kind of came next in terms of the processing. There's the kind of the planning stage and the research piece, and again, part of the kind of the whole and being intentional about leaving well and transitioning well. What are some other things?
Well, funny you should ask, Dan, because one of the biggest things was I hired you as a life coach.
Yay! That was a good season. That was good season that we had, and I'm blessed to be part of your journey in that way.
Oh, you are part of my story, Tim. I talk about it all the time. It was the best decision I made was to invest to have somebody walking alongside it, very focused on me and what I was doing. And, your wisdom and experience, and one of the reasons that I was drawn to you is our personal friendship, but also that you and Eve had just gone through a big transition yourself. I thought, well, they know from experience, and that you were starting to work in this area, so you were skilled and trained in it as well. So I thought, no, I'm going to, take this leap, and I'm just so glad that I did, because especially in terms of leaving that side of the transition, the 2 sessions that we had before I left were very foundational in helping me to leave well. Not only did we come up with some really good practical steps, but I think also for me, knowing that I had the accountability that I was going to talk to you again after, to be like, well, and you were not like a hammer and nail sort of person, but I knew that you were going to ask, well, how did it go? And so I didn't do it, Anna.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Just like I always am. It never ceases to amaze me how that coaching process and that coaching relationship, just something as simple as accountability, a structure built into that coaching season, is so helpful for us in moving forward. I hear so time and time again, those that I work with in a coaching relationship will say, well, what's been so helpful is just knowing that, I'm gonna meet with my coach and they're gonna ask me, how did that go?
It's true. It's a simple question. It's so powerful. So, we came up with some really practical and tangible things for me to use as tools. And Jim, I have a tendency to be very hard on myself, to beat myself up for things that, I didn't do well or have a lot of regrets. And I'm shocked to say and very pleased to say that through this leaving process, I left with no regret.
Wow.
I don't mean I don't regret anything I ever did in my 50 years there. There were plenty of things, I wish I would have done differently. But I mean specifically about the leaving, I have never been plagued with that thought of like, I wouldn't have done that, or I never got to do that. Great. That's such a surprise for me. That's not typical for me. And I think that came from us working on some ideas of how to make the most of that time. And I feel like I made some good choices. I think I've seen a lot of people leave over the years and have heard other people's stories, not even necessarily where I worked, but heard other foreign missionary stories of returning back to their home countries. And I was taking notes without even realizing it. So I had a couple cool ideas. I spent some time, a few weeks, transitioning in Europe on my way back to the United States. And that was like a little mini buffer transition. And it ended up being with all the various places I visited were all people connected to my work in Iris. So it was a little trip down memory lane, which they were people I could talk to about my work and how I was feeling. So that was great. I went to a retreat. It wasn't a re-entry retreat. It was a general retreat for missionaries. The leaders focused with me on my re-entry. And there's value in doing that later. I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any type of job even lined up. I just left and wanted to come home or come back to the U.S. to a restful season to process my experience and walk through everything in a peaceful way. And I felt like I was able to do that because of having that set aside time.
Yeah.
Thinking about member care and what I would eventually be doing. But I think through all these decisions and the things that we talked about in the transition coaching, I worked really hard to lead well, to prepare the people who were going to be following after me, and to honor the environment I had been in that time. And then I feel really proud of how I left. And it's such a nice feeling. It is a nice feeling that I feel grateful to be able to have that.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely, leading well, is something that you can definitely celebrate, and entering well too. And I think that, like you said, there's a lot of benefit in being intentional, and especially when you have the gift of time. You have these 18 months before, and then intentionally set aside time after landing in the U.S. to really process and be intentional about that, and rest and reflect. And those are all so important to a healthy transition. At the same time, there's also these kinds of transitions that are we don't necessarily have the gift of time to process in leaving. Maybe it's a forced transition, a rug pulled out transition where you have to leave quickly, or you have to shift roles quickly. The visa doesn't come through. Heaven forbid, war erupts in your country. Something happens, and you don't always have, or team dynamics too, relationship issues. Yeah. Wow, those are so many. Yes, so many things can come around to where we don't always have that time. But I just want to pause here and say, for those who might be listening, or for those who know people who have been in those kind of quick transitions and don't really have time, there's other ways and there's other strategies to process those kinds of transitions as well. And I think that's important as a reminder that we can be hopeful about whether we have the gift of time to really process a transition up front or not.
Right. I agree, Tim, because while I'm very grateful for the time that I've had, and both the 6 months of knowing to be able to prepare to leave, and then the time after, the 6 months after, to adjust to having left and returned to the U.S., I'm so comforted by knowing that for all those people in those other circumstances that you mentioned, that God still knows and is still coming alongside people even during, like you said, there's other strategies and other ways.
Other ways, yes.
Thankfully, He's not going, oh gosh, I wish you had more time. I wish I could have helped you if you had a few more weeks.
Right.
That's not how it works. So there are, and there's different dynamics, and there might be different painful experiences or ways to process, such as, thankfully, He still knows how to minister to our needs and how to send people alongside us to help with that, the Holy Spirit within us to help with that. So I'm grateful that even people without that same amount of time, that hopefully they don't discount, the transition process and what it can be. It'll just look different for every person.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And those things don't take God by surprise. So we know that there are other strategies, other resources, and I love to keep that in mind. Whatever kind of transition someone is going through, there is hope. There is ways to process. The whole theme of intentionality kind of has woven its way through this conversation, and you have been really intentional. And there's a lot of reasons you can celebrate. Just that whole area of not having regret and being able to celebrate that. That's just so great to hear. And let me ask you this: what about access to support and resources? Thinking of people that are out there, some of us out there on on the field in certain areas, more remote, may feel very isolated, may lack resources and support in terms of just their relationship with their own organization. How did you get what you needed to help you successfully navigate the change that you were processing?
That's a good question. I think I'm a little bit naturally a researcher, and I have a bent for thinking, what do I need and how can I get that? So I think I just started asking questions, of people, and I started asking people who had left before that I was close with, what they did, or wish they'd done. And then with everything online, there's so much available, so I found that, and I'm not even sure, trying to remember how I found out you were doing, I think it was through Facebook, I think you put on there that you had started Encompass Life Coaching, and so I must have clicked on it, here's a friend who's like a new venture too, and then I must have tucked it away, and when it was time for me to go, I remembered that, and contacted you. So
right.
I think it does help to be a little bit proactive and think there are going to be things that I'm going to encounter that are unfamiliar in this process. I think that helps, because if you're thinking, no, I'm just moving back, or I'm just going through this big transition, it'll be fine. Sometimes I think that's when you get caught unaware.
Yeah.
So in terms of finding the resources, I think I just believed that they were probably out there, that people had walked this road before me, and I wanted to learn from that. So, and then I tailored it. I tailored it to the parts that suited me or that fit me, and I feel like the Lord helped me with that as well.
Right. Yeah. And that's the beauty, of technology today, isn't it? There's so many, in terms of member care resources and ways that you can get support, counseling, coaching, a lot of different ways. Like you said, there's a lot of different things and resources online. And I would hope that those who are listening to today who may be in a more isolated place or feel like they're lacking support and resources can reach out and find the support they need. Because it's out there. It's just, like you said, you got to do some research and be intentional, but it's definitely out there.
It really is. In my new role, I'm carried on with Iris Ministries, but home-based, U.S.-based now, and working in missionary member care. And I'm learning as I go, and I'm spending so much time researching, and I'm stunned and do wish I had known, when I was still even on the field, how many organizations and people just want to serve and bless and come alongside missionaries, and how much is out there online. There's audio teachings and audio messages, and there's blogs, Rocky Reentry, which I thought was a really good blog for helping people with, returning after. But it could be for any time when you've lived outside the country, not just for foreign missionaries. But anyway, there's just so much, and it stirs my heart. It really blesses me to think how many people are trying to come alongside people who are out serving, and so there are a lot of resources out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's really obvious you've been intentional, and but even with all that intentionality, no matter kind of how hard or you try to be intentional, there's always life on the other side of transition, and what that looks like, and how did it meet our expectations, and so for you, what were some surprises after? On the other side of transition, and what were things that shocked you, things you didn't expect to encounter since being home?
It's such a good question, Tim, because there's so many things that even if you read about them or you know about them, and even although your question is what you didn't expect, even when you expect them, they still kind of take you by surprise, and the impact that they have on you. Mm-hmm. One of the things that came up frequently that did really surprise me, that I hadn't quite expected, but I guess it is a form of reverse culture shock, because how often I didn't feel like myself. I would be in the middle of something very ordinary, and I would just think, I don't even recognize who I am right now. And I don't mean that I was going off on tantrums or any particularly odd behavior. It was very internal. And so it's very hard to put your finger on and describe. But I would just feel like everything was just off kilter a little bit, and that was really surprising to kind of figure out, like, do I even know who I am, right now, or I don't know how I've changed, and maybe some of the ways I've changed don't fit in so well here. So maybe that's causing some disconnect, or I don't mean to say that they don't fit in, but they would look differently here. You can even hear in the way I'm talking about it that it's hard to describe, know.
Yeah.
That was surprising how often, and that endures until now, 18 months later. I still have that feeling quite often. And I hadn't really experienced something quite like that. The other thing is, more here, not throughout the beginning of the process, but, what I'm feeling now is I'm very surprised after 18 months. I thought that I would have, found my feet more by now. I knew it would be hard and challenging, and I was anticipating, some of the roadblocks and stumbling blocks, I guess, that come up. But I thought by 18 months I'd be kind of back in a groove, and in some ways I am, but not the way I thought it would look. Not the way, not as thorough of an adjustment as I thought I would have made by now. Perhaps I was very unrealistic about, okay, you put all this effort and work into it, but it still is going to take the time it takes, and
right.
Things do creep up and surprise you. And yeah, the isolation I sometimes feel internally and externally, that surprised me. It shouldn't have surprised me because it's kind of somewhat of an obvious and thing people talk about, but I guess it's knowing that it might happen versus how it makes you feel. Those are the things that take you by surprise, I think.
Yeah, right, and also how long these feelings might come or resurface.
Yeah, and they do.
Yeah, they do.
And they, I don't feel the way I did in my first couple months. I don't feel that those feelings quite so often, but the fact that they kind of still creep up and pop up and surprise you, that they're still there. Well, things to sort through.
Yes. Well, I'm almost into my third year after a big transition, and I can totally relate to that, Laura. That still things come up, feelings, like you said, it's a lot. Some of it's internal, it's identity issues, who the whole question, like you said, who am I? And that is understandable, although our expectations aren't always there at that realistic level of thinking. We're always hopeful we can do this in a shorter amount of time. It will just take a year to get my feet on the ground and feel like I'm, rooted and have a sense of purpose or an identity going forward. And always encourage people to think that it could possibly take longer, some of those things. It doesn't mean like we're not accomplishing things along the way or moving forward in different ways, but always that internal piece processing could take longer. And again, it goes back to God's purpose as well, in terms of what He's doing in us and how He's shaping us and preparing us for the next thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and isn't it interesting? Had we never gone through a big transition, had we never left to go to the mission field and then returned, and we just carried on working in the United States and our own culture and norms, God would still be at work, and we would find other touch points for what we're learning.
Yes.
Like, since college I've learned this, or since marrying, or since having children. But now if we have this big touch point of since my life on the mission field, so it feels like it's always tied to the transition, and in some ways it is, but it also is just a part of God growing and processing in us. But
so true.
We touch back to that spot, Does that make any sense?
Yeah, very true. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's why I think that, when we talk about these characteristics of transitions and principles and strategies and tools that we can use, and I think so much of this applies not only to those who have made big transitions like this from maybe from an overseas context to back in the States, but just transitions in general, whether that be big shift in ministry or work in career roles or family transitions, big moves, whatever kind of transitions we're going through. I'm hopeful that what we discuss in these podcasts are things that we can pull out and apply and gain insight from in order to move forward in our unique transition story. What would you say to someone, Laura, someone maybe they're 6 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years into a major transition, and they're still struggling. Maybe they don't feel like they've really made any headway or progress, or don't feel like they've gotten their feet on the ground, or still struggling in some area, even internally, identity and purpose. What would you just say to someone like that? Maybe they expected to feel more settled, have more clear direction, not feel like a fish out of water, like many of us do at times. What would you say to people like that now that you're 18 months on the other side of your transition?
It's such a great question, Tim. My biggest piece of advice for anyone in that situation would be to seek out support. And as much as personal as that can be, reading books is helpful. Reading blogs of people. There's one called Rocky Reentry that I think is an excellent blog. But one-on-one support where you can tell your story. So whether that is a coach, a transitions coach, if it's a counselor, if your medical insurance covers counseling, if your church offers free or reduced cost counseling for missionaries, or maybe a church in your area, if your church doesn't. So many people have such wisdom to share, and they've either walked that road before or they've walked through it with other people. And I think that one of the things, if you've been back 6, 12, 18 months, and especially if you're still really struggling, I mean, there's going to be after effects, but if you're really in a place of struggling, you can feel more and more isolated, because by that time you kind of feel like people have heard my story already. They're sick of me talking about this. I don't know who to share this with. So if you can talk to someone who can come alongside you, I think that it's very powerful, even just to tell your story, to be prayed for by someone who gets it, who doesn't say, well, yeah, I probably too, right. sort of things, and lets you experience your unique situation, and we're not all the same. We won't all have processed it even the same, but at least people who've either walked it before, or in the terms of a counselor or coach, maybe they've walked alongside other people before, and they've seen enough to know how to be a voice of wisdom. And God doesn't call us to walk through any of these things alone, and isolated by ourselves. Yeah. So I just think there's a lot of people who understand where we've been and want to offer that help.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is helpful. I hope so. I hope it helps someone, because I thought of it recently and I really thought to share it with you during this podcast. Mm-hmm. And that is that I've been mulling over myself why, in terms of a transition, why the transition when I was going to Mozambique, it was full of unknowns, scary unknowns, a lot of things, but it felt exciting and expectant and invigorating. But why did this transition back to the U.S., which was full of unknowns, didn't know what my work was going to be or anything like that, or what life in the U.S. would be like, why does it feel daunting instead? What is going on inside of me that isn't seeing that God has exciting and good things ahead for my time in the U.S., just as He did when I was going to Mozambique? I don't know if it's because we're going back. I'm not sure what the dynamic is there, but I'm mulling it over because I think that it happens to us often, and I want to have a posture that says, Lord, anytime I'm entering an unknown, but I feel you leading me, I want to have that same expectation that good things lie ahead. There might be hard things too. There always will be.
Right.
That there's good things and that He's going before me in the same way. So I just offer that if that maybe people could mull that over for themselves. If that's been a factor and what God wants to show them in that. Because I don't have the answer yet. I'm praying through it.
Yeah. We are on an adventure with God, and thinking like you, I'm committing to a year, and it turns into almost 15 years of adventure with God on that in Mozambique, or it's short-lived, and yet all of this is part of our transition story, and it's really, really exciting to think in that terms. Kind of reframe. I hear you saying reframe the leaving piece and the way we look ahead and our expectations toward the future when we leave. To kind of reframe that in terms of this exciting adventure with God as well. That part hasn't ended. That we have a lifetime. We have an eternity for that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Right.
That's great to be able to land on this as we wrap up our podcast today. Great advice from Laura Anderson today on just take time to process that transition. Tell your transition story to someone. Find trusted friends, mentors, counselors, coaches that you can begin to process and share your transition story with. Great way to wrap up our podcast today. Thanks so much, Laura, for joining me today. This has really been a fun conversation.
Oh, you're welcome, and it's been a privilege. I was honored that you asked me, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Tim.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. All right.
Okay, you have a great day.
As a transitions coach, I love listening to and supporting my clients as they tell their transition stories. Book a discovery call with me at EncompassLifeCoaching.com if you're interested to learn how working with a coach can help you get intentional around this time of transition. Thanks for joining me today on this episode of Navigate Podcast. I've been your host, Tim Austin, and if this has been helpful to you, would you mind rating the podcast, writing a review, sharing on social media, and of course you can subscribe so that you're sure to get in on the next episode. And I'll see you there.